So I've been a performer, composer, improviser. I've done a lot of things over the years, some of which I'll talk about today, but not all of them. Through that time, a big part of it has been a kind of like a running strand of DIY. And as I started it, it was more, I guess I feel lucky in the sense that I appreciate the hobby of craft as well as the sort of aesthetics and the sort of the bounty that comes from craft. So I think even if I didn't make music, I would make things, so that's worked out kind of well. But for a big strand of it, DIY has been kind of part of that. So for a long time that was in objects or hacking objects, and these days it's more in code to a certain extent. I was a student here. I did a PhD. I finished a few years ago that talked about the integration of all these aspects of what I do. Also teach music for a living, and I teach people about all this kind of stuff. And there's some other stuff in there as well. So I'm going to talk about a few different things. So primarily it's going to be centered around technology, how it interfaces with what I do, and then the aesthetics of that and the technical concerns, the two kind of branches of it. And I'll kind of jump back and forth between the two as I go. I'll show some examples of the stuff, so both in terms of videos and stuff, as well as showing bits of code and musically relevant examples of stuff. And then at the end, or maybe I think we'll do it in this order, I'll talk about this Max for Live device that I've been building over the last year and change. It's basically done. I just need to put tip and tail and do documentation. So that's what I'm going to do today. But first I'll kind of show you some of what I do. But you get the idea. It's just to sort of show a thing about. So this stuff, there's a general thing. So a lot of what I do in the last 5, 6, 7 years has been oriented around drums and percussion, and there's something about which I find interesting. And my general approach to electronics and processing with this has been to be generally reactive, and usually around onsets, because there's no shortage of onsets and when you hit things. And generally speaking, not exclusively, often non-pitched. So this gives you certain parameters with which to process and work, where certain processes that work well with pitched instruments don't, and vice versa. So a big part of it has been oriented around this type of processing. And some of the audio processing, which is what I'll talk about, I won't get into the visuals of this one so much, is oriented around that. To give a little background of this stuff, this was an outgrowth of a very long-standing collaboration with my partner, who was the one who was doing the visuals and the text at the concert yesterday. That we've had groups that it's varied over times, but it generally has visual and audio components that are integrated from the ground up and developed this way. So we had a band in Miami, and we rehearsed, like we'd meet every day. There was drums, there was guitar, and there was an artist, and we rehearsed. Like we did this. It wasn't something that like, okay, I want an artist at the gig, and you just get an artist for the gig. Like it was meaningfully part of it. And that grew over years to turn into many things. But I'll skip a whole lot of background there. But there was a very big shift where we went from working on canvas. So she had these big canvases that she would stretch at a venue and paint on and then remove stuff, of which PA has one in his office. Yeah. A few of you actually now have it in your office. But when we went from that, there was a bit of a problem in that when we finished the performance, there was an unfortunate side effect that there was a visual artifact left. There was an object that was beautiful, and that was a problem because that wasn't what happened musically, and it wasn't what we wanted to happen. The fact that there was a nice looking painting wasn't what we were after. So after a lot of thinking and talking, and we did experiments with projectors and stuff like this, we found that dynamic lighting afforded us the same kind of ephemeral quality. The lights happen and then they're gone and there's nothing left. And that it's not necessarily important that it mirrors what was happening musically, but that was closer to what we had in mind. That there was a moment in time in which there was art happening, and then that moment was over. And that was what we were after. So that's a kind of give a little background of how that comes. And then in a general thing, that what I was just mentioning a second ago of the meaningful integration of when you get to cross-disciplinary things, that it isn't just a tagged on thing. That's just like, oh, like a dancer showed up on the day and we just did a thing. Because that, generally speaking, is bad. That makes for bad things. But somehow a lot of money, I don't know. Those things are inversely related. So there's a lot of things that went into the DMX side of that, which I won't show the code of that. It's less interesting looking. A lot of just numbers and lists, but I guess that's all it is anyways. But I'll talk about the audio side of it. So this is, actually I'll show this and then I'll work backwards a bit. So the bulk of the audio processing, actually I'd say 90% of all the audio I did yesterday was this one effect. And I'll show the guts of it. It's nothing terribly complicated, but the idea being I wanted to have something that was reactive and dynamic in terms of live sampling, but that was, for the most part, self-managing. That I, as a musician, can carry on playing, but processes will continue in a manner that's related to what's going on. And for me, the best way not the best way, one of the ways that I tried going about this was this automatic dynamic resampling. So I'll briefly explain what it does in a large sense. I'll show you what it sounds like, and then we can look at some of the code. But whenever there's an onset, it records a small amount of audio into I think it's a 1 second or 2 second rolling buffer. So every time there's an onset, it just tacks a new bit of audio to the end of it, in random length. So it may catch the whole onset, it may not. Simultaneously, it will then play random position from this buffer of onsets. So every time there's an attack, it's both reading and writing, and then it can do that in either like reading one chunk or reading multiple chunks. So that's the general overview. So I'll just kind of show you, we all kind of know the classic brushes. I'll spare you jongli, but there's brushes. And I'll just kind of turn the effect on in a stationary thing so you can have a listen. So you kind of see the buffer get filled. So this is more of the wet that we're hearing. So that's in its basic state, the chunk mode, in which where every time there's an onset, it will play one chunk. So it's basically just a dynamic accompaniment for every onset you do. It will play an accompanying onset. So that's the idea. But then I kind of extend that a bit more to have a grain mode where every time you do an onset, it has a probabilistic set of grains that get played back randomly, and it gives you more of a kind of a live granular synth thing, where with this, whatever it is, 1 second buffer cycles out over time. So this is with the grain. Amount of likely transposition and panning or not, and just how hyperactive it is, and the likelihood of an individual grain being reversed, which is, for percussive stuff, quite a thing. So the bulk of what I did was that, and one of the things that I quite like playing with this is that it shuts up. It isn't a process that you begin and it'll just carry on. So I don't know if this will feedback. Will it feedback? What do you think?
If you do what?
This?
Nah.
So yeah, what I like, that's too loud. What I like about it, that it is reactive, but at the same time, it allows you to follow gesture. It does have the unintended side effect of more or less mirroring your gesture. Like it's not going to do a gesture that I don't do. But I find that a very interesting way to play, because I can use it to just kind of augment what I'm doing in terms of density and texture. So and literally, for the performance of the night, I had 2 instances of this with different settings that I turned on and off. And other than the section that was feedback, that's literally all that I did. So you can get a lot of mileage out of it because of what you're feeding into it is what's going on. So now, in terms of what it does, inside is pretty unremarkable. Like it's nothing especially magical or terribly interesting in there. Some onset detection. I have a thing that will start and stop. So this is spitting out both an attack and then an accompanying offset that's based on other stuff. And that's just recording into just a looping buffer. It just kind of tacks on and tacks on and tacks on with a little crossfade at each one, so we don't just hear a bunch of clicking. I was told it was a Max Symposium, so I brought Max. The playback is what's this one based on? I think it's just play, just a normal play-based Anderson. No, it's a groove. Simple windowing. Yeah. With some ducking stuff in there. The panning, the way I've decided to do panning with these most recent ones, probably better ways to do this, where it spits out probabilistically each grain either to the left or the right, and then there's a patch afterwards that lets you control the width of that. Crude, but it works very well. And then the cloud bit. So just determining whenever a bang comes in, it either passes it and plays one onset, or it goes into this feedback loop with random delays of random amount of possible bangs that will happen with random timings within them. And then the activity knob is a macro control that tunes some of these parameters, just how lively it is. And that's kind of it. There's nothing else. There's some panning and some wet dry. So code-wise, relatively banal, but musically quite useful when played in a kind of an instrumental manner. It's just like a tool thing that is part of the thing. DSP, boring, but quite musical. So this is that there. It's part of kind of some of the general view of how I view playing with a computer as a musician. So for 99% of what I do, when there's a computer involved, there's also an instrument involved. And by instrument, I mean the computer's instrument, as in like an acoustic instrument of some sort. So these days, largely drums or percussion or piano or guitar or some other instrument. So it's working alongside or an augmentation of. Therefore, for me, I don't have not only the physical overhead, but also the mental overhead of being able to manipulate things on the computer in any kind of granular manner. I don't have enough fingers to move all the parameters that would be interesting to move in the context of performance. So everything I've geared around in terms of my program and such is kind of a macro view, something that will give me an overview and let me move things in a certain direction while still being able to be musically lively in what I'm doing. Like my hands are busy, I'm doing stuff, I don't have time to move the decay. Like it's not physically possible or musically possible. So this is a subset of that idea of having this kind of macro view of stuff. And then these pieces in general, these two ideas, fall into this kind of approach where I've done where, and the thing that we did yesterday came about, Brian and I and Angie Skyped, I think 3 times total-ish? 3.5, let's call it 3.5. Or 2.5 if we start 0. Some rough behavior and some rough sections. And then setting up a kind of framework of technological support and behavioral things. So in these pieces, so the light vomit one has something that looks kind of like this. I've called it a score, I don't like that word, but it's a sequence of events of either processing or light-based behaviors. And the other one has a bit more complex, but a series of behaviors that act as just containers, which I'll then fill. So as a creative person thinking about it, I'm thinking, okay, what kind of interactions do I want? What would be musically and visually interesting? I'll craft and I'll test and I'll play with it and I'll come up with this thing. This is a thing, and when I do this, a light thing happens or it doesn't happen, and audio does or doesn't do these things. That works. I'll sit there and I'll play with it a while, and I kind of occupy this space, and I'm familiar with what that container is like. So then I set up a sequence of these containers, which I then move through in performance. And I found that to be a very useful way to work for myself, being that I'm a big fan of improvisation, and specifically the ephemeral quality of now, and how now will be gone, and how that's a beautiful thing and a fragile thing, and to sort of maintain that essence of now, and can still keep that while still having high level, I mean this high structural level, not high art level, because it's all bad, high level view of structure and form and things that will happen. Okay, so to not have a sausage form where I begin and then at some point it ends. So to have something else going on. And over the years, this has kind of refined and kind of changed and developed, but roughly yesterday and these 2 pieces that I've talked about work in that manner. I also did some testing with specific playing techniques and developing some of that microphone feedback stuff to do more complicated things. I'll show just a tiny second of this with the ruler. Sounds much cooler than it looks. Or will. And so on. I'll kind of leave it there. It's worth talking about, but I'm not gonna. But like the microphone performance technique, I find to be a really rewarding way of playing, and it's like a little microscope that the smallest movements have a huge impact on what happens. And developing like performance techniques and a practice around that idea, I found really interesting, but not so relevant to now. Okay, so I'll move on a bit. So Rhythm Wish, this is taking a very different approach to working with technology. So I'll show you just a bit of this, and then I'll talk about what's going on. It's important to see the beginnings and ends of stuff because the middle sucks. That's usually how music works. kind of get the gist. So what's happening in this one is there's a computer involved, but I didn't have nothing to do with it. It's a CD player, just an old Discman, a Sony D2 Discman that just has a recording of me playing drums on it, and it's sitting on the drum. So that's the only processing that's happening, is the drum triggering the CD player that has drums on it getting jumped around. So my idea with this was a bunch of years ago I had done this recording where it actually had come to me in a dream, which is a terrible thing to say, but there was a Bach prelude that I really liked, and it was a really nice Glenn Gould recording of it that I was just listening to, and I was like, man, I felt compelled, like it was like a calling that I need to learn that piece, and I need to put it on a CD player, and I need to play the piece all while the CD player is playing it as well, and glitching out. Like, I felt this was an important thing to do. This is before I kind of knew much of Nick Holland's stuff, so it just it was just an idea that just kind of happened, and I was like, I need to do that, and I went through and I learned the whole thing, and like to be able to kind of dissect and do that. I'll just play a tiny bit of the recording of that. It's back when I used to make recordings.
It might be quicker if you close the videos.
No, it's just, I think it's just de-authenticates you.
Each time?
Yep.
Occasionally.
Right.
About every 5 minutes.
Really?
Yeah.
There's a really strong radio signal in the building
Yeah.
opposite.
It's not that, it's the controllers boot you off. So if you restart the Wi-Fi connection.
You had your chance at school? Or no?
Oh, you're
It's
gonna go
Apple's
to the phone.
problems now. Yeah. I'll just kind of talk over it a little bit while it kind of plays, but while performing this, I found at the time it was a different approach where I was doing a more wounded, modified CD. So it was a CD that I just filled with the recording tip to tail, and then scratched the CD up, put bits of tape on it. I had a really shit desktop CD player that before, had no anti-skip as far as I know, because why would it? So it's just kind of doing that on its own. And there was a lot of really beautiful serendipity between this system. Now, this one isn't reactive at all to the audio, because it was just sat there, so it's glitching on its own, but it quite musically kind of does that. And this sort of like cadence that it's gotten going, it's now sort of progressed into it was really beautiful to play with. So it came out much better than I was hoping for in my dream anyways. But this was the start of that idea of having a material and a material on a media that is going to be broken, and combining them to create a blur between the two. This works particularly well in recording. So for example, the one that I showed you with the drums, if you were in the room, you could tell the difference between acoustic drums and the recording of acoustic drums kind of the speaker, even though the speaker's in front of it. But you can kind of tell the difference. On a recording, it really blurs. The two become one. So this was started with that kind of idea. So I had wanted to do that in a new way now. So I had gotten this sort of Discman, and I know that these you can modify and circuit bend and do all this kind of stuff. And this one, I had gotten one specifically that you can unmute. So there's a little pin that you pull, and normally when a CD player, when you hit pause, the CD's still spinning, the laser's still there. It just actually kills the audio. That's all the pause button is doing. So what this modification does, it lets you not do that. which is actually kind of, you will hear in the recording, but if you hit play or when the CD gets first pulled in, the laser runs the whole disc and you get this kind of like kind of stuff. So you get all these sounds that you normally wouldn't. So I modified it. It's using Nick Collins's, the cool one. Unmuted CD hex. So he's got a cool PDF. The PDF doesn't explain it fully. I emailed him and he was very kind and explained the whole of it. But there's something really poetic that I find about this that goes beyond just. I find it technologically interesting. I find it sonically interesting, but some of the ideas I really find almost philosophically interesting, like the aspect of it's not time travel, but the way that I do these pieces, I showed up in the room early in the day, set up a recorder, recorded myself, cut it up into segments that seem sensible, put it on CD player. So it requires physical sampling and prep ahead of time. But then during the performance, this is hours later in the day, I've done things, there's been sound checks, there's been other stuff. But what I did earlier in the day is still in my head, it's still rolling around. I remembered roughly, I did some things, I kind of remember the order that they happened, but not really. And then as I'm playing, the tracks are on the CD, I'm going through tracks, the CD player can jump around, and it's basically a record of me and my memory digitized, which I'm now playing with now myself, along with the specter of what that memory was. So it's like a memory conceptual feedback loop in doing this, in the act of performing it, coupled with a physical feedback loop of the CD player is sitting on my snare drum. So when I hit the snare drum with a certain amount of force, it jostles the CD player and causes it to skip, which can create all these sort of cool artifacts, but can also skip to tracks ahead and behind of it. So that adds this kind of dynamic, also onset-based processing, but in a different physically coupled way. In doing this, I also found that I did a bunch of audio analysis after the fact. This wasn't especially relevant to it, but I found that I knew this while I was doing that, but because of the CD and the radii of it, the different distances around the diameter of it, it's smaller area in the middle and bigger area in the top. So towards the first track of the CD, you have about 130 milliseconds. So if I pause on track 1, it's a 130 millisecond loop. And if I pause on track whatever towards the end of the disc, up to like 250 milliseconds. So depending on where you are in the CD, the is a different length. I also found that although it was consistent, it wasn't perfectly consistent, but it also wasn't random. It seemed to be multimodal in that, like, it would be, I kind of did a little histogram and some analysis thing for an emulation stuff I was doing later on, but where it would jump around randomly in tempo, but it didn't sound to me like it was a random tempo, and it wasn't. It would jump to this kind of distribution. So most likely it was right on time, but then you had these sort of different modes, and it would kind of taper out. And that gave this sort of like this sort of CD player-like glitch that sounds really nice and was hard to emulate for something I did software later on until I did this analysis of it. Now it sounds pretty great, but that's a different thing. I also found that different CD players, the seek button will jump different amounts of audio at different rates. So the one that I was doing, the Sony D2, jumps about 500 milliseconds every 50 milliseconds. And I did this, I just recorded like a long sine wave and then kind of recorded myself seeking and then checked it and compared to see how much of the sine wave had gone and how much time that took, and figured out that. And then another model that I have does longer jumps and longer periods of time. So that's that piece. So I talked about this. Oh, I didn't talk about this so much. There's a whole bunch of stuff during the performance and even watching it back each time that I do it that, as it turns out, I know myself pretty well. So I'll do something in the recording, also knowing that to leave a certain amount of space because I will then be adding material later on. But on the CD, I'll done something and leave some space, and then, okay, this is a good time to hit something now, and I'll hit something now and carry on. The live version of me likes doing that too. There are several moments in the performance, and each time that I've played it, where I'll be like, okay, leave it a little, and I'll hit a thing in unison with the recording, which is super uncanny with percussive stuff for this happen, but it happens enough to be aware that this is, it's me, it's the same decision-making apparatus then and now. And one of the things that I've done this 3 times, each time I've kept the CD and I've kept all the files for it. I think maybe by the time I do the next one, once I have enough of these recordings, what I want to start doing is on the CD itself is include a track from a previous version to have this iterative memory fuck thing happen across time as well. So primarily based on that one, but so it just kind of grows and smears this blur as it kind of goes on. Eventually I'll have maybe more performances that I have tracks for, but I want to kind of extend that out in the time, and I find that interesting, but it doesn't have to do with technology. And lastly, I want to talk about this. So this is something that I've spent on and off, these days less off, but in the periods much more on, working on this Max for Live device of just doing some concat synthesis, of which I've done a bunch of years ago, and then I wanted to do it again better based on some stuff that PA and Alex had done. Just I wanted to have something that worked well and wasn't a big pain in the ass to do, which some of the ones that sound good are a big pain in the ass to use. It's just that you have to learn a bunch of things that are very dependency dependent, version specific things that it's really almost not worth the hassle. So in order to do that, you always make your own. That's the solution to every technical problem.
Create more technical.
Yeah. So I won't talk about all these in so much detail, or I might talk about some of them, or if people have questions about any of the specifics of them. But there was a lot of concerns going into this because I wanted to do things, I wanted to do them well, and I wanted to have a certain amount of musical usability in it. Like, it was fine enough that it did the thing that did it well. Actually, I'll show you the thing first. So first, some dry audio.
I'm so glad we made it. Look how far we've come, my baby.
I've actually written an essay about that 10-second audio. That's pretty all right. I can load different ones. Some electric guitar in there. Some snare. So this is some snare. I can combine them. So this is using different ones at once. The colors represent So, some of the sides can make many more sounds, but I just want to show a little rough idea of going from accurate resynthesis to less accurate resynthesis, and how that works, and well, not how that works, but why that would be the case. So in doing this, there's some generic stuff about synthesis, which I'll kind of skip some of this stuff. Maybe here, I'll start here. I heard this in actually one of your talks here a long time ago, that if you had an infinitely big corpus, the way this kind of resynthesis works, rather than ask that kind of question, you have a database of audio that's pre-analyzed, and you have some incoming audio that is analyzed on the fly, and then the incoming audio, it matches the nearest sample from the database and plays that back, is the general premise of what's happening. And a nice line that PA had heard in this room a long time ago was that if you had an infinitely big corpus, the output would sound like the input, because every possible permutation of that would be represented and it would be the same. So the idea being there that that's not desirable. So by doing this in any manner, what you're actually after is the imperfections. It is the quantization error, and how you decide to implement that is what will make this interesting. So having a corpus that will lend itself well to this kind of error, and how you manage that error, is what's musically interesting about this kind of technique of resynthesis. Because if it sounded great, you could just skip the bit in the middle and just have the input sound like the output, and you're done. And problem solved, perfect resynthesis. So that was a big concern of it going into it. One of the things that I wanted to be able to do with this one, which I didn't do before, and only the really big ones let you do this kind of stuff, is to have multiple corpora. So I can load one body of samples, and then I can load another one, and then match the nearest one from the whole pool of it. So that took a little bit of work. It wasn't too complicated. The way that I've handled it, and we can look at the code in a minute if we want to go that deep with it, is that I have just a database in which every time I add a new one, I just index everything forward. So if I had like 10,000 entries, the next one started 10,001, and all matching I just subtract 10,000 from. So I just keep track of the database and how it moves along. And then I can choose to use every one of the databases, or just the one, or the individual one. And then in addition, finding an elegant way to do that. So I can select this one and I can have it just be that one, or this one, or I can have it all, just to have a kind of a tight interface that makes as much sense as is possible for this kind of complicated a type of processing, and not have, because it's something that I had spoken with Alex, to say you want to have multiple corpora and have multiple slots that you can load them in and individually turn them on and off, but then that becomes a little unruly in terms of how you negotiate that musically. So that's how I did that. And then what I've done to remove individual corpora, which I couldn't do before, which is using beta of one of Alex's new ones, is every time I load stuff, I was left the problem if I wanted to take this one out, I have now a gap in the data, which would be a pain in the butt to deal with. So Alex's more recent version of this loads things so fast that if I want to remove an individual one, I just remove that one and then just actually load everything again, and everything gets smushed down. And it happens fast enough that it's transparent. There's a problem, depending on, well, actually with every corpora, every corpus, is that generally speaking, the input and the output, or the input and your database, do not match. So if I have a violin and a tuba, they're very rarely going to have the same pitch, or the same thing with any of the musical parameters that I'm using. So how you compensate for this, and I've done it two ways, and they're both useful, and they apply to different things. So the first one, which I had done in an older patch, was normalization. So I take the min, the mean, and the max of the input that you could either pre-analyze or do on the fly, and I scale that to the min, mean, and max of the database. Min and max on its own wasn't useful because you have wild outliers, and in the way that I was doing it was literally the min and the max. So that mean gives you a pretty useful control of that. So I scale the min, the mean, and max, and that gives you normalization. So the highest sound you make, or the loudest sound you make, corresponds with the highest and lowest sounds of the database. And this has basically the effect of giving you a wider spectrum. So generally speaking, you'll have more highs and lows by doing this. And I'll show a musical example of that in a moment. And then the other one was compensation. So let's say I found a grain that's, I need this pitch and this volume and this centroid and all this kind of stuff. And the nearest grain is over here. And it's kind of close, but it's not right. So what the compensation will do is, with a certain amount of controllable parameter, how much that will get pulled to it. So if I want the pitch to be smack on, if there's a grain that it matches that was pretty close, it'll actually transpose the pitch and or the volume. And then what that does, it gives you a more accurate, it's particularly useful for pitch-based material. Yeah. We'll let that one slide there.
I like the way when you look at two people in particular.
Yeah. So these two ways of managing mismatches in input and output have their pluses and minuses, and they can be combined. So I'll just actually kind of show you a bit of that. So I've got the feedback snare one. It has a lot of pitching, so I'll use that one. At the moment, I have no compensation, and I'll just play some Shania Twain. Oh. Something else is happening. Oh yeah. Okay, so it's not finding a lot of those notes. So in my snare, I don't have any of those high lows. I've got that one note, and it's nailing that one. Okay? So the correction, what I'm going to do is I've got a pitch parameter. So as I turn this up, you'll kind of hear it more. Actually, I'll do this with the Shania one is. I'll do a Shania with the accordion. I've done that one more. So here's. So you can kind of hear that it's you can sort of tell the melody, but there's very clear notes that it's not finding, and it's just trilling between the note above and below.
Yeah, because the accordion's fixed on, so all the vibrato.
Yeah, the vibrato's gone. Thank you for using the musical terminology there. So I'll adjust the pitch correction. So it's finding the same grains. It'll be actually the same grains that we're matching. It'll just magnetize them to the pitch that we have. So you can hear there's still some notes, the gaps, because the things that don't exist in the database don't get matched at all. So it looked for that pitch, it actually didn't, because I can set a weighting of how far it's going to look for each one, and that's a whole other thing that's worth talking about. But at the moment, if it doesn't find the pitch, it doesn't exist. So it'll find the closest thing it found and then transpose it. At the moment, I've left it, it's clamped but not so clamped, so you might hear like these random low notes that's sort of matching a thing. So I've left it in there because I wanted to have that scale, and it does the same thing with loudness. The loudness is less apparent in something like this, but it's still very useful. So this is a fully corrected version of that. So this is probably as clinical as it would get.
Still better than the original.
Yeah. So that's the correction. I'll show you the normalization. For this one, I'll put a drum sample. That might be more useful here. So this is the brushes. Okay, so that's the normal one, and then this is just using the regular settings. So I've got acoustic drums on here, or if I want, I'll learn it. Okay, so when I turn this on, you get a lot more of the highs. You can hear there's a bit more lows. It's not perfect, but you do get a wider. It's inadvertently pulling some of those pitches down.
What does the learning do? I kind of missed out.
What learn does to normalize the input to the output, I need to know what's coming in.
Okay.
So I have some presets here, kind of some generic ones. Actually, let's try it with the normal drums. Let's see what it does. Yeah, I think maybe that sounds a bit better. What learn does, there's a rolling buffer, and then it just analyzes that buffer for what's actually in it.
Can you put the loudness correction in as well?
Yeah. I should just try doing Shania. Female voice. Put some different stuff in there. So you change key. Yeah, so it's the mean has pushed it up. I didn't remember which order I did those in. So correspondingly, I guess if I do, yeah. I need forming correction. All right, so that's how I've dealt with the mismatches in input and output, while at the same time keeping in mind that this imperfection is actually part of it. So it's like a constant fight to make it better. Yeah, not perfect, because if it gets perfect, then we're missing the point. Yeah. All right. End.
It could take a couple of minutes to...
No, yeah. There was one other thing I was going to talk about. That was worth mentioning. Oh, yeah.
Can you do live input corpus analysis?
Yeah.
Building corpus.
As it goes,
Yeah.
no.
You have a separate corpus maker there.
Yeah, I have a separate one for corpus maker, because it makes all of this. Yeah. But yeah, one thing that I showed at the beginning of the demo, but at the moment it was, for most of what I've demoed here, the input analysis window and the playback window are the same, as is all the other parameters. And this gives me accurate representation. So it sounds, the output kind of sounds like what it's in. Actually, this would be go Shania. You know, that's just as close as it's going to sound. But one of the things that I wanted to do, and the way that I used to use the old version that I had of this that wasn't so accurate, is it was almost like a creative accompaniment. So the moment I go into this other mode, the playback window is now random. It's no longer coupled with the analysis window, meaning that I may play back a bit of audio that is bigger than what was analyzed. So what's after that analysis window is now random. So this is basically, it's just introduced random information to it, which sounds pretty cool if I still keep the compensation on. In addition, I can change the window types and slow it down. So this is Shania stitched together from accordion, electric guitar, and snare. And you can hear, so the initial chunk it's matching is correct. That's fine, but then there's all this extra stuff. It's also aperiodic, so we don't get that granular, smooth kind of thing. And I quite like this in the same way that the same cloud effect from earlier. The moment you shut up, it shuts up.